Welcome back to Scaling Theory. My guest today is Peter Howitt, Professor of Social Sciences Emeritus at Brown University and recipient of the 2025 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, awarded for the theory of sustained growth through creative destruction. Peter is a fellow of the Econometric Society and of the Royal Society of Canada and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. With Philippe Aghion, he wrote the 92 Econometrica paper that gave creative destruction a mathematical form, along with endogenous growth theory and the economics of growth. Anyone listening to today's episode will walk away with a working grasp of why competition and innovation do not move together in a straight line, and why the answer turns on where a firm sits relative to the technological frontier. Peter explains the escape competition effect without equations and draws out what it implies for treating competition policy and growth policy as the same policy at different timescales. The conversation then supplies a way of telling apart a merger that buys innovation from one that removes it. Peter also sets out the route by which an incumbent converts market power into political power and why he regards that as a more serious threat to growth in Europe and the United States than anything happening in the laboratory. The second half of the conversation offers something rarer: a first-hand account of how agent-based modeling works and what it can establish that a theorem cannot. Peter is candid about why a method that it still believes in has taken 30 years to find an audience and about what would change that. We end on AI agents as economic actors and on what sustains a research partnership across 4 decades. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Well, Peter, thank you so much for coming on the show. This made my day when you agreed to my invitation, which actually would be my very first question, a question I never asked anyone, very unusual, but why did you say yes? You just got the Nobel Prize. You must receive invitation on a weekly basis. How come you decided this one was an interesting one?
Well, I got a lot of invitations, you're right, and I think I've declined about 95% of my invitations, but there was no traveling involved in this one. It sounded to me like it's an interesting podcast. It deals with a lot of things that I'm interested in. Of course, the economics, the growth, the technological change, innovation. And you obviously have a big interest in how AI is relating to all of this. And I have, for the past few months, been going to a lot of places giving talks, and wherever I go, people hear that I've worked on creative destruction, and they want to hear about artificial intelligence. And I'm not at all an expert on artificial intelligence, but I've sort of had to learn a lot about it to answer people's questions, and I've thought a lot about it and how it relates to the work that I've done. So I thought this would be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I'll try my best. You've also written on general purpose technologies, right? So you may have a thing or two to say about AI.
Right.
All right. But so maybe before we dive into your work, let me ask a question not about all the famous papers that we're going to talk about in a minute, the econometrica, the inverted U relationship. I want to ask about an idea that you published that you thought would actually have more impact than that idea had. Is there anything that comes to mind?
Oh, I've done a lot of things that I didn't think should have had the impact that it should have, but I think in general, as you know, a lot of my time, my research time over my career was spent on what I originally called disequilibrium analysis, and which I later morphed into what people would recognize as agent-based computational modeling. And to me, it's an approach that's ideally suited to dealing with the questions at the heart of macroeconomics, which have to do with coordination and how it takes place among agents without any central or with, a minimal amount of central direction. One of the great questions of economics, and of course, one of the great questions of macroeconomics, is how sometimes that coordination seems to fail. We get depressions, serious economic downturns. And I've tried to model that a little bit, as you know, and it hasn't caught on. I'm maybe not surprised, but disappointed that I haven't yet seen it really take off. I think it will sometime, particularly since our computational abilities are getting stronger and stronger all the time, and our ability to handle vast data sets that we would ideally use in agent-based economics is increased. But it's taken a lot longer than I had hoped.
Yeah. And we've actually seen that, right, in the history of economic thinking, a paper being published and taking years, if not decades, to be fully appreciated. I'm thinking The Nature of the Firm by Ronald Coase, right? And at some point, I remember that Ronald Coase complained that the paper was not cited, and it might be now top 5 most cited economic papers ever, right? So there is hope. All right. So what I've done is that I divided my questions in 3 parts. First, I want to talk about creative destruction. Indeed, we can't escape it. Then I like to talk about computational economics. We just hinted towards this direction already. And then I may have some more personal questions. So we'll see if we can manage all of that. But so going back to part 1 of the conversation on creative destruction and talking about one of your very famous papers, the one on the growth through creative destruction, Econometrica 92. I will put all the links in the show notes. So what you did here is that for the first time, if I'm not mistaken, you actually put in a formal model the idea of destruction being the heart of growth in the economy. Now, looking back at the paper, when was the first time you thought, well, actually, this paper may have an impact? Was it when you first got the idea, when you started writing it, when you finished writing it, when you saw where it will be published, or maybe even years after it was actually published?
Well, let me just say a little bit about the origin of the paper. I started working with Philippe, my co-author, in 1987. We met at MIT. I was there on a sabbatical leave from the University of Western Ontario. And he was a beginning assistant professor, just got a freshly minted PhD from Harvard. And we met. It's a very collegial atmosphere, the MIT economics department. People's doors are always open, and Philippe was a very gregarious person, and so it's only natural that we would have met. And I remember him asking me, you're a macroeconomist, he said, and I'm a microeconomist. I've heard a lot about this idea of creative destruction from my course in IO that I took from Dick Caves at Harvard. But it was mentioned as just sort of a curiosity, and it's not part of the growth theory that we talked to, that people use. It was based on the solo model, in which technological progress is exogenous to the economic system. It's not affected by the economy. And everybody benefits uniformly from technical progress. And that's not what Schumpeter talked about. There's no creative destruction involved there. There's no innovations, no R&D, so on. Why isn't it? And I felt, well, that's a good question. And we set out to create this model. And we realized that a lot of the advances in patent races and R&D races that had been taking place in industrial organization theory could perhaps be used to model this idea. When there's competition between incumbents and rivals, and the rival wins, the incumbent suffers, there's creation of something new. There's the destruction of the business prospects of the incumbent that failed to keep up. And so it didn't take us long to create what looks like a really neat macroeconomic model that had this in it. And Philippe was immediately very excited by this, but he's more excitable than I am. We have very complementary personalities. Okay? So, and I do know that he really thought at first that this is going to win us a Nobel Prize. He really did. It didn't occur to me that it was really important until we started presenting. We wrote it up and we started presenting it at seminars, and everywhere I went, I got a really favorable reception. And I was, but I've had favorable reception for other papers, but never as much as this one, and from people that had never really appreciated a lot of my work in the past. And so I knew we were onto something big, and that's why, and so did Philippe. We kept working on it, and it wasn't until maybe 10 years later, after people had, we've written a couple of books, we had published a lot of articles, done a lot of empirical work, together with Richard Blundell and his associates at University College London, and written a lot of papers that have met with success. People started telling me, "Hey, maybe you can. This is something you can. You'll get the Nobel Prize for." Eventually, I gave up thinking that, because after 25 years or so, you can say, "Okay, well, that's right away, right from the beginning, we knew we were onto something big."
Yeah, very interesting. I'm smiling because something I mentioned to you, but not to the listeners. Obviously, Philippe Aghion way better than I do, but I met with him a couple times when he wrote the preface of my PhD a couple of years back. So I get a sense of what you are saying in terms of excitement and indeed the character behind the work. But so going back to the model, right? So now there is a name for that, the Aghion-Howitt model. It's been years. It's been at least 30, I mean, more than 30 years now that it was published. What you say today is the single most misunderstood implication of it?
I think people understand it pretty well. The original model did have a number of implications that have been neglected by the profession, which is fine. I guess they're not as important. I mean, we talked about how there could be multiple equilibria, for example, how there were certain implications about the statistical properties of the growth process, other than just the average growth rate, which came out, which nobody really paid much attention to, perhaps rightfully so, because we're missing a lot of the elements or aggregate demand and a lot of coordination problems that are important for explaining the variability of growth. But, I think people who have cited the work and in other work that's been well cited have interpreted it pretty accurately. The one thing that some people don't realize is that the paper was pretty much finished in its final form by 1988, and it didn't get published until 1992. That's not a really unusual thing. I mean, it's at the upper end of the distribution of publication lags, but it's not unusual. When I was on that sabbatical leave, 87, 88, I wrote two other papers that were published in top economics journals, and they were all published in 1992. So it takes a long time. And by 1992, we were really well into this whole research project. But in terms of the implications, I think it's been pretty well understood by people who've cited it and tried to develop it.
That's good to hear. So, as you said, out of this one, you published more papers and books, including one, 98, MIT Press, entitled Endogenous Growth Theory. And in that book, you actually implied that competition policy and growth policy are the same policy operating at different time scales. So, on that basis, would you say that Schumpeter, that we already mentioned in the conversation, was simply wrong to fear that antitrust would kill the goose?
Basically, yes. His understanding was incomplete. The model does have a Schumpeterian impact. There is we predicted theoretically and ended up confirming empirically, at least for the UK case, and others have done it for other countries, that there's a sort of an inverted U relationship, that if if you get too much competition, that can have the Schumpeterian effect of blunting the incentive to innovate. If you can't earn enough monopoly profits to justify the R&D expenditure, the R&D is going to slow down. So Schumpeter was right in that sense, but he was incomplete because when you have lower levels of competition, more competition can be highly stimulative. The thing is that Schumpeter was focusing on innovation by outside firms that had nothing to lose from creative destruction. They were not the victims of the destruction that they created. But in our model, we had to take into account not only those firms, but also the firms that were on the technological frontier themselves and had to innovate in order to stay on that frontier. And those are the firms that are more incentivized by higher levels of competition, more intense competition. And that's an effect that Schumpeter didn't talk about. And I like to think that what we did was to make his ideas operational. We were able to build a model that could be taken to the data. It gave us a sort of glasses with which to see how things are operating a lot more precisely. And we can see that not only is there this countervailing effect, but what we found, at least in the UK case, was that most of the firms in our sample, and it was an example including half of the publicly listed firms in the UK, were on the part of the curve where the escape competition effect was the dominant one. And so it was pretty clear that the overall effect would not be of raising levels of competition, would not be the Schumpeterian effect of diminishing growth by diminishing the incentive to innovate by outsiders, but it would be the escape competition effect that would stimulate growth. And I think that's true for many other countries. And it's, so I wouldn't, Schumpeter was right, but it didn't go far enough. And he captured an important effect, but it turns out it's not the most important.
No. And it's, in a sense, the beauty of his work, which is that it is not operationalized. And so it gives room to other scholars to come in and actually make it a bit more specific. Let's jump in time twice. So first, let's go to 2009. So you have another paper published then entitled The Effect of Entry on Incumbent Innovation and Productivity, in which you show that the threat of entry is itself a powerful driver of innovation, especially for the firms that are close to the technological frontier. And now let's jump in time a second time to 2026. We have new guidelines by the European Commission. Those are very heavy, but there is one thing that I think relates to your work, which is the fact that the European Commission, when it comes to merger control, wants to integrate what it calls the innovation shield. And the idea would be that some acquisition of small innovative firms could actually be facilitated because it would be seen as a way to stimulate innovation. Now, my question is, do you think those are two different philosophies that cannot work together, or do you see them as compatible findings?
The problem with that, as I see it, and I don't understand it, I'm sure, in the detail that you do, but just the general idea that you would facilitate the acquisition by larger firms of small, highly innovative firms, it's not clear that that's going to intensify competition. One of the ways in which established firms can try to escape competition, other than by innovating, is to engage in preemptive mergers. Somebody comes up with some new ideas, a highly innovative young firm, which might threaten their core business or the existing firm. If they can acquire that firm, at an extreme, they can just bury the innovations because they'll acquire the property rights to it. But more generally, they can maybe try to blend that innovation into the existing technological trajectory that they're on without threatening their core business model. And I think that for new ideas to have their full impact, for the creative destruction process to really work, every once in a while you need to have a fundamental change in technological trajectories. And And I think that allowing this kind of a merger facilitates this anti-competitive kind of behavior on the part of existing firms. They're always facing an alternative. They're always faced with competition from new technologies. One way to deal with that competition is to try to stay ahead by innovating yourself. And another way is to try to prevent those new ideas from developing. And there are many ways you could do it. You could do it by creating patent thickets. You could do it through lobbying to change regulations, change laws, or regulatory capture. But, this preemptive mergers have been used a lot. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's one of the mechanisms by which almost every industry in the United States, and I think this is true in Europe too, but I don't know the data there as well, has become much more concentrated in the past couple of decades than it used to be. And, we have this David Otter has been writing, I'm sure you're aware of this, about the rise of superstar firms, not just the big Google, Microsoft, Metas that we know about, but throughout all industries. It's evidence that there's been a lot of increased concentration, and and Philippe and I have argued that has been leading to a lack of a decrease in dynamism in both in the U.S. and in Europe. So I understand the logic of this movement by the European Commission, but I'm very worried that it could have the opposite effect. And I honestly don't know enough about the details of how they plan to implement this idea to know.
I am actually finishing a paper on the guidelines, so very much into it. A risk we see is that if you open such an innovation shield, you open the possibility of getting it wrong. And you've mentioned regulatory capture. It's not the only sort of capture. It could be any other ways of capturing here the European Commission to get the merger through when there are no good reasons for that, which makes me want to ask you a question. What is your relationship with public choice theory? Because all of that, to me, I associate with public choice economists. Do you feel connected to it? Do you feel disconnected? How do you position yourself?
I think public choice theory is very important. I've even written a couple of papers on the subject, not particularly important ones. The most important implications of creative destruction are probably political implications, because I think that, Schumpeter thought that capitalism sort of contained the seeds of its own destruction. And I tend to agree with that, but for quite different reasons. He seemed to think that capitalism, where the process of creative destruction will allow it to survive. You'd have these very rich people that came to dominate and have inordinate influence over society, and that this is really good for us economically, but people would resent it. And in a democratic system, people would find ways of making it more and more difficult for the successful innovators to really reap all of their benefits. I see it as a different thing. I see it as a danger that when incumbents get strong enough, they end up getting a lot of political power as well as a lot of financial power that they can use to retain their dominant position in their industries. And they'll need to block competition, and they can do that with enough power. They can, I take a look at the fossil fuel industry in the United States, and it's probably true in Europe too, but I know it as well. The people who follow dark money in politics will tell you that a huge percentage of it comes from fossil fuel interests. They're worried about becoming the victims of creative destruction in the energy sector from innovations by clean energy, and which really threaten their interests. And I think that this illustrates an important danger, and that the whole rise of superstar firms sort of illustrates the danger. And what Philippe and I have connected that to the diminished strength of innovative forces in the United States. I think these established interests need to be shaken up once in a while, and but politics is very much getting in the way of this, and the ability of powerful economic interests to influence politics in the U.S. is really critical for the growth process.
You've mentioned another MIT professor, if I'm not wrong, David Otter. Let me introduce another one, Elting Morrison. I don't know if you are familiar with this professor who passed away years and years ago. He was a professor of the history of technology, and he published a book entitled Men, Machines, and Modern Times. The book was first published in 68. And in that book, he actually describes how every disruptive technology, of course, he wasn't using the term disruptive at the time, is always welcomed by the people with a position of power. Stage one, they ignore the new technology, right? Stage two, they start explaining how it cannot work, it is stupid, it is limited. And stage three, they engage in the name calling. So they create fear around the new technology. How do you relate that to the explanation you just gave me on creative destruction? Is that something you observed, or would you observe different dynamics?
It certainly sounds plausible to me. Yeah. I mean, the biggest example I see of this is in the fossil fuel industry. And certainly I see examples of all of those practices.
Okay, let's move on to part two of the conversation, because I think it is very unique. And as far as I can see, maybe not as discussed as the part one we just discussed. So I want to talk about computational economics, whatever the name is. So you have a paper published in 2000 in JEBO entitled The Emergence of Economic Organization, in which you built a computer simulation that you partially developed at the Santa Fe Institute. I was very pleased to see that on the first page of the paper, because that place is very dear to me.
Yes.
In that simulation, you have shops, a trading network, and even money that emerge from the agents following simple rules. And you extended that work in another paper published not too long ago in 17 in the same journal entitled Banks, Market Organization, and Macroeconomic Performance. Now, as far as I can see, a Nobel laureate engaging in simulation is not common. And so, why did you engage in it? Was it because you thought you could actually get something out of it more than if you were to write a theorem, despite the profession maybe not welcoming that as other methods? So, what was your state of mind when you engaged in this research?
Well, to begin with, the work with Clauer was really part of an ongoing research project that I had that he was involved with. He was my he had provisionally been my PhD supervisor, and we became friends and co-authors over the years, and had written a number of papers together. But we were always interested in the general question, the foundations of macroeconomic theory and issues of coordination. And he and I very much believed that to understand the coordination process, you needed to do away with what we called at the time the auctioneer in general equilibrium theory, the agent that somehow or other made sure that everybody was in an equilibrium, that everyone's expectations and actions were mutually compatible. We thought that the central coordination problem of society was trying to understand how that takes place. And we also believed that to understand that, you have to understand that there are actual agents, not just sort of mythical, theoretical agents out there in the economy that are helping this coordination process. And those are largely business firms that create markets. When we trade, we do basic supply and demand theory. We just sort of presume that there's a market there, that there's a uniform price that's established somehow, as if people had somehow got together automatically. People don't. people have to search for each other. And there are firms that create mechanisms that allow people, suppliers and demanders, to get together. And when you engage in your daily economic activity, to go shopping for groceries or whatever, you don't just go wandering around looking for some old groceries. You go to a grocery store. And so understanding the origin of firms to us was the same as understanding the coordination of them. But you had to deal with this in a way that didn't impose an assumption of equilibrium at the beginning. So it occurred to me that if we could just put this on the computer, we could maybe do enough simulations and repeat them that it would be almost like an empirical analysis. We could say, well, okay, you make these assumptions, and X% of the time, a coordinated state emerges, and otherwise it doesn't. Certain changes make it more likely, and so on. And instead of proving theorems, we could establish some statistical regularities among what you would call emergent properties that are related to coordination. And it turns out that there was a very simple model of people getting together in a highly abstract theoretical situation where people had goods they were endowed with, but they had a preference for consuming some other good. And they had a propensity to wander around and to meet each other. Some people would get the idea of setting up a shop where it became common knowledge once people found that, or that they could go there and find people with complementary preferences to trade with. I remember spending one summer at a summer cottage teaching myself C++ and trying to put this thing into a computational model. And it turned out it wasn't too difficult. And we came up with this original paper, which, a lot of people who are doing your agent-based computational analysis now cite that paper. I've tried to follow it up with other people, with Kamal Ashraf and Boris Gershman in this paper that you referred to about the emergence of banks. We had another paper on the costs of inflation. It hasn't really caught on. I present it to various places, and I know people just don't find it very persuasive for some reason. It continues to be cited by people doing agent-based computational macroeconomics, but that's a very small group of people.
Yeah.
And I'm not surprised. I mean, there's a lot of creative destruction in academia as well as in business. People defend their own human capital. It's only natural. And, I know Max Planck was famous for having said that science progresses funeral by funeral.
Yeah.
And which is just a sort of I think that's kind of an apocryphal saying. But I mean, what he said was something that other philosophers of science have recognized, which is that new ideas come into science not so much by established people seeing what they were wrong and changing their minds, but rather by influencing young people who don't yet have a reputation to defend, or the body of human capital that they've developed that we want to protect, who end up just taking over from the older generation. So I think that's what's going on in macroeconomics. The idea of a rational expectations equilibrium is losing its popularity. At one time, it was the only way to get things done. A lot of people are trying to build more adaptive models, but they're sort of starting from the framework of a rational expectations equilibrium model, and they're just kind of relaxing one assumption at a time. Whereas I really think that you got to start from a very different place to make sense of the whole coordination problem. And there aren't many people ready to do that yet. He was trying to take an aha moment at some point. Somebody really smart and much more energetic than me is going to come up with a marvelous thing that makes people pause and think, whoa, this is maybe the way we should be going. It makes graduate students think, oh, yeah, I want to write my dissertation on this subject. And there was a bit of an aha moment in agent-based modeling in general in microeconomics when Thomas Schelling wrote his famous segregation model. It was the computational model. He did it with coins on a chessboard. So, people had extended it for computational models. But it's the same sort of idea. You have autonomous agents who are following simple rules. None of them have anything like a complete understanding of the environment that they're in. And yet some order emerges. It might be different from the order that people have in mind when they make their own decisions. And that's how I see macroeconomics is developing. I mean, we're in this little human anthill where, just like the ants, we're developing this very complex organizational structure without any of us really comprehending the full system-wide implications of what it is that we're doing. We have a lot more neurons than the ants, but our organizational structures are also much more complicated. I think at some point it's going to become much more popular. It has in other disciplines, in sociology and many other areas.
Biology. Yep.
In biology, yeah. It's,
Urbanism. Yeah. Biology. There are many fields.
Right. And the computers are getting so much more powerful than they used to be. And a lot of macroeconomics really wastes the power of the computer, spending all this time solving for very complex equilibrium behavior of a sort that goes far beyond what you could ever imagine a real human being is doing. And whereas I think we could be using it to model a lot of the complexity that's out there and the heterogeneity, and trying to introduce some of the lessons from behavioral economics, which has mostly been a microeconomic discipline, into the behavior of the agents within a complex macroeconomic model to try to see what kind of patterns emerge. And how is it that we end up in these highly complex economic systems with no central planner telling everybody what to do, in a situation where we're typically within 95% or so of what we measure as potential output, and with only a small percentage of people unable to find jobs. It's a miraculous thing that I would love to understand more deeply than I do. I mean, we have general equilibrium theory that shows that it's possible, but only if you have someone to tell everybody what the equilibrium is going to look like, so to guide their expectations.
Let me ask a couple follow-up on that. So you've mentioned the fact that still to this day in economics, people deploying agent-based modeling gather amongst very small networks. And SFI, the Santa Fe Institute, is of course one of them. Are you still in touch with the people there? Are you visiting SFI, or are you not anymore?
No, I'm not really active in any area. I just had my 80th birthday. Octogenarians don't tend to make fundamental contributions to economic science. I'm happy to let the next generation take over. I did spend some time in Santa Fe. At one time, I was involved, a couple of times. Axel Leyenhoven and I once tried to get people at Santa Fe interested in a macroeconomics, agent-based macroeconomic project, not very successfully. Years later, I visited there a couple of times with Dylan Farmer and Bob Axtell and a number of other people. And we were building an agent-based model of the housing market of the Washington, D.C. area. These wonderful data set, basically all of the real estate transactions that had taken place there for many years, and had access to a lot of tax data on the individual level, anonymized, of course. And we built something which never quite went anywhere, I'm afraid. I visited Santa Fe 4 or 5 times over the years, and it was various attempts to get some agent-based economics going. And I'm not sure what's going on there now, actually. I hope that there's still a lot of activity.
Yeah, it is. I was visiting there last year, and it is very vibrant, I think, as much as ever. So, and momentum behind this kind of research. I'm French. I've been living in the Netherlands for many years. As they say here, congratulations on your birthday. So
Well,
that's all right. Another question on that. So, of course, computational economics, usually it's more like a method, right? That you deploy to the field.
yeah,
To some extent, it could also be today that we look at computational agents in the actual economy. I'm thinking AI systems that shop, price, negotiate, transact on our behalf. If that is indeed a thing that is not ready to disappear, do you expect that they will invent new institutions? Because in your research, you actually find those institutions being created by agents. They establish the shop, they establish new conventions. Do you think we're going to see new institutions being invented, or is it not something you would expect?
I expect that we will have institutional evolution just as we always have, and it will definitely be different with agents. At this point, I'm not sure that we really understand what's going to happen with AI agents. It's a new technology. It's a very new technology and could go in many different directions. And I worry a little bit that we're not controlling what direction it's going in. We're just sort of letting it evolve without a lot of central guidance. We're getting markets that are organized by artificial intelligence. We already have those. I mean, it might not be the kind of artificial intelligence that suddenly has been flourishing in all the last 5 years or so. But you look at Amazon, for example. I mean, that's a highly automated marketplace that has emerged from competition and does much what the little shops that Clower and I talked about are doing, getting people together, but in a much more complex environment. And we take a look at other websites that are creating markets for people, or in which there are complicated algorithms that are computing prices and changing prices on a regular basis based on information coming in. There's unlike kinds of shops that we've seen in the past. This will continue to happen, I'm sure, and we're going to get more and more sophisticated kinds of markets, and especially when we get to the point where we're used to having a lot of drones make our deliveries for us. It's going to be a much different experience even than it is now.
What about not the impact of AI on the economy, but the dynamics within the AI sector? And here I have to talk about the paper that for competition scholars is the most important, competition and innovation, a inverted U relationship, right? In which you show that competition spurs innovation among neck to neck firms and discourages the followers. If we try to see whether or not that holds true within AI, do you think that the inverted U still holds? Or because of increasing returns, would you expect that the top of the curve will actually get swallowed by winner take all?
I think that it's going to be changing. I think it is changing, and I think it's changing because established firms are beginning to realize that they have to deal with competition more proactively than they have in the past. A lot of firms, of course, have learned, and this was a long time ago, but it's still very much in people's minds. I think the lesson of Eastman Kodak, who resisted the new technology of digital photography, they made what they thought at the time was a rational decision not to develop this technology. It was actually, I understand, invented within Eastman Kodak, but they decided to just put it aside. They had such a flourishing business at the time. I think a lot of firms have taken a look at that lesson to see how others developed that technology and destroyed them. They had the possibility of doing it themselves. And a lot of firms have decided, okay, well, it's time, when a new technology comes on the scene that they can see, they better adopt this technology and start getting on board and developing it. And even though it's going to destroy a lot of their old capital, They better do it to themselves before other firms do it to them because they want to survive. And I take a look at a lot of the finance behind the big AI firms in the US right now. A lot of it is coming from established firms that are potential victims of some of the firms, and but they're financing them themselves. And to me, so a lot of the finance behind Anthropic and OpenAI is coming from Google and Microsoft and others who have a lot to lose from the new technology. And I see this as them learning a way to get on board with a new technology, which is very difficult to do within a firm. The firm has an existing corporate culture that is developed around their own technological trajectory that's been established. Very difficult to change that within the firm, to have another department that's working on something that's that's conflicting and competing with what's going on in another department. Basically, what a lot of these big giant firms are doing is is helping to finance independent organizations that are not in any way connected to their own corporate culture. They're uninhibited by that and free to develop, and yet they're retaining a stake in this new technology, which might end up harming their past investments, but they're still going to be playing in the game. And I think that this is a sign that firms have really learned how, incumbents have learned how to deal with that competition in a way that they hadn't in the past. Exactly how that's going to change the inverted U, I'm not sure. It on the face of it, it seems as if it's going to make the escape competition effect even stronger. The more competition there is out there, the more even the established firms are going to, they're finding ways to try to survive that competition by financing innovation.
Yeah, we see the willingness to cannibalize their own business model to be going up, right? Compared to what used to be the case. I'm thinking also Blockbuster as an example of a company who refused to do that when Netflix appeared and
Right.
went from 4,000 stores in the US to one, I believe. Let me conclude with a more personal part. And here I have two quick questions.
Okay.
Cannibalization. There is one relationship that you never cannibalized. That's the one with Philippe Aghion, your co-author. You've been working together for nearly 4 decades, which is longer than most marriages last. The very obvious question is, what is the secret? And is there still subjects in which you are in disagreement that you keep arguing about? Like an old couple, right?
Yeah, we don't argue a lot. I know Philippe has often worried that I've been spending too much time working on this computational side of my research interests, and he's been very effective at arguing without denigrating my other work in any way, but arguing that the work that I was doing with him was more important. And I think he was probably right. It certainly has been more recognized. And he even went so far as to enlist my wife in his arguments. I mean, when he thought I was behaving quite properly, he would call her, tell her, "Oh, he must talk to Peter. It's so important that he do this work, and I know he loves to do this other thing, but he's like someone who thinks he's a great poet and he wants to do this poetry, but really it's like he's so good at doing these crime novels with me, and that's what he should really be doing." Philippe and I had a very complementary personalities, and I think that's been very helpful. I mean, when we would be working together, we'd run into what looked like it might be a dead end. And Philippe was always very quick to say, "Oh, well, let's scrap that." And I was always the one that said, "Well, let's push it a little further." Sometimes he was right, sometimes I was right. But I think either of us left to our own devices would have pushed on too far. He would have thrown too many things away. We worked very well together. We enjoyed each other's company. We still do. And it's been a great relationship, a great friendship. The friendship continues, and he's still working very hard on growth theory. I am not, but there's no real disagreement.
Yeah.
Has sort of persisted over the years.
Okay, let me see now if I can bridge. This will be the final question. Your computational work and your personal life. So, in your computational work, you model people as trial and errors creators, right? Rather than optimizers. Now, so let me ask about the Peter Howitt, the man, and not the economists. When it comes to big decisions in life, where to live, who to love, I guess this you don't really choose, but who to marry, where to spend the next Sunday. Are you an optimizer thinking very hard that will be the best decision because this and that, or trial and error man?
I think I'm more a trial and error man. I tend to be impulsive. I tend to follow my nose. Certainly in my own economic research, I followed my nose. Until I met Philippe, I really had nothing to do with growth theory. He asked me this very interesting question, which I told you about, and I thought, well, that sounds interesting. And I didn't really sort of sit and think, well, is this the best way of the use of my resources? I had other research projects going, but it sounded interesting. So I put everything else aside, spent the next couple of years just working on that without really giving it an awful lot of thought. My wife and I have lived in different places over the years. We were living in France for a couple of years.
Yeah. Okay.
And ended up moving back to North America. We bought a house in Columbus, Ohio, because I'd taken a job offer from the Ohio State University. We bought the house there from France without ever having been in it, because we'd seen it driving by on an earlier visit to Columbus, and we trusted the real estate agent. And he thought, okay, well, let's buy it. So I would say that I'm not really an optimizer.
Where were you in France? Was it Paris or another place?
In France, I was in Toulouse.
Okay.
At what at the time was called the IDEI, the Institut d'Économie Industrielle, that had been organized by Jean Tirole and Jean-Jacques Lafont.
Oh, so the two of them already left the MIT at the time to go to Toulouse and started that.
Well, yeah. So Jean-Jacques was their person. He was the organizer of this institute. He was one of the greatest academic entrepreneurs I ever met. He managed to build a private corporation within a French university.
Yeah, good luck with that.
That was really quite amazing. And it was a very successful one. And it morphed into the Toulouse School of Economics, and it's still very successful, and Jean's still there. And he's been a great friend for us. I failed to mention that when Philippe and I first met, and we started adopting these ideas from the patent race theory, we got a lot of help from Jean Tirole, who was also at MIT in 1987 and 88. And it was just putting the finishing touches on his theory of industrial organization, which had a marvelous chapter on patent races. And Jean has been a big supporter of our research over the years, and is still a good friend. So, yeah, we've been to many places. We even thought of staying in Toulouse. We were offered a permanent position in Toulouse, but it was a little too difficult from a family situation. We had two older children who'd already left home and had started to go to university in North America. This was before the telecom revolution had reached the point that it was now, and that we were spending $1,000 a month on telephone bills across the Atlantic.
I do also remember that. Yeah, calling family in the United States.
Yeah,
very expensive. Yeah.
So when I got this job offer from Ohio State, that sounds pretty good. So we took that.
Yeah, trial and error. Yeah, and it worked out pretty nicely in the end.
Yeah, it's worked out. I have no complaints.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that, I think it's a good place to end the conversation. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Of course, thank you so much for everything you've been publishing. It has been very influential on me and many of my colleagues. So thank you for that. And to everyone out there, take care of yourself. And if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.